Leslie, could one say that a book is nothing more than a painting of words, which are the notes on the tapestry of the greatest film ever sculpted?
One could say that. But should one?
No, one probably shouldn't. It was a bit complicated, but it wasn't too far off from being a pretty good description of what ekphrasis actually is. Umberto Eco, a well-known literary critic and novelist, simply explains ekphrasis as being a literary description of art. Ekphrasis can be something as simple as when a novel is transformed into a movie, or a painting being transformed into a poem. Eco also notes that it's important to recognize the difference between ekphrasis and pictorialism. Pictorialism emphasizes the subject matter, tonality, and composition. The difference is that the picture that ekphrasis paints is itself a picture. Ekphrasis stages an encounter between two different mediums, one visual and the other verbal. Here's a really quick example of ekphrasis from an American poet called Wendell Berry, who was inspired by a watercolor painting from artist William Blake called Jacob's Dream. Take notice of how he uses language and literary techniques to create his own kind of work of art from ekphrasis. And it's not just like a summary that pictorialism might have done if you were to describe the picture in the same kind of way.
A stair appears that bends and spiral towards the light, the bright orb where it ends, though he sleeps through the night. Darkened below the stars, angels in constant motion walk up and down the stairs. Delight and clear devotion make graceful all they do. The light and dark are bound, heaven to all below, bright stair and stony ground, in one light joined.
So from this section of Berry's poem, you can make sense of his description of how heaven and earth are divided and yet connected. The poem is able to paint its own picture of dualism being portrayed in the painting through the use of ekphrasis. Many works of the past are only known today because of ekphrasis. This leads to the next point that Eco talks about, and that is how ekphrasis has changed. So there are two that Eco talks about in his writing. The first is classical and explicit ekphrasis, and that was meant to be appreciated as a good description of a painting or of a statue. The other one is modern occult ekphrasis, and that aims at evoking in the mind of the reader a vision as precise and evident as possible. Eco states that in occult ekphrasis, an author starts from the double premise that 1. That if readers do not recognize the visual source, they can in some way discover it for the first time through their imagination, as if they are watching the scene for the first time. And 2. If readers already know the visual work the ekphrasis is referring to, they will get additional pleasure from the rediscovery of the work through a verbal description. Occult ekphrasis is simply the verbal representation of a visual representation. Ekphrasis can be written in any literary form of verbal description, but I will mainly focus on the use of ekphrasis within poetry. Through my research, I actually found an interview of Umberto Eco, and he talks himself about the difference between poetry and prose. Take a listen.
First of all, for me, there is a radical difference between prose and poetry. In poetry, the words come first, and then what you have to say follows. One beautiful poem on Montale was speaking of certain flowers. I think were anemones, but doesn't matter. Flowers with a beautiful name. One day they were walking, and there were anemones there. And Montale said, "Oh, how beautiful they are." "Oh, God, you wrote an entire poem about them." I say, "My poems are about the words, not about things." It means that the poems of Montale are full of reference to flowers. He never saw those flowers. He was reacting to the words. The words started.
Poems are about words, not things. This line definitely stood out to me during this interview. In a poem, and especially in ekphrasis, the focus are for the words to communicate artistically, not the task of describing something in perfect detail. The words should become a textual art piece themselves. It should evoke emotion and thought. I wanted to learn more about ekphrasis and the other forms that it may come in, especially the ones that I didn't know before researching it a bit more. And I actually found an article named Museum of Words, The Poetics of Ekphrasis from Homer to Ashbery. The author points out another form of ekphrasis called notional ekphrasis. Notional ekphrasis is the description of imaginary work. The example they used to talk about in the journal article was one of the first ever cases of ekphrasis used in Greek poetry. Homer's extremely detailed description of the shield of Achilles. In the case of Achilles' shield, what Hephaestus wrought on the shield is ultimately impossible to visualize. So language can not only rival, but actually displace the work of art it describes and salutes. It itself, the words, can become more prestigious and well known than the actual item it describes, especially in the case of notional ekphrasis. The description of the shield is the artwork itself, as no shield actually exists. Such was Homer's skill as a writer, and his use of ekphrasis was able to bring an imaginary shield to life and now lives in legend. Ekphrasis can create amazing works of poetry and prose. The description of art can itself be art, especially through the use of ekphrasis.